I'll go back to the beginning piece of advice, which is don't negate or neglect the value of using emotions in training. It's the sole reason that people will actually change their behavior.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are and wherever you're watching from. My name is Matt Pierce, host of the Visual Lounge, and today we've got a fantastic guest. Now, when someone recommends a guest to me, you know, I'm always open to guest recommendations, but when someone like Debbie Richards recommends a guest, you stop and say, who? Can you please introduce me? And then you go from there. And she recommended this guest, and I'm so excited to talk with him. He's got some really great things that he's learned that are research focused, and I think can really help you start thinking about how you make your videos and what kind of things you're putting in your videos to make them more effective. So let me go ahead and introduce our guest today. Richard Fleming is deeply passionate about movies, believing firmly in their power to enhance people's lives, and with a remarkable personal archive of thousands of films watched, Richard brings a wealth of experience and knowledge to the table, having worked in every facet of film and video production, including the impressive feat of editing a Super Bowl commercial, and he's honed a unique skill set. Richard operates at the intersection of filmmaking and learning design, blending art and science to create corporate training programs that are not only effective, but also engaging for employees. In addition, he's a certified foresight professional, utilizing a science-backed framework to foster creative innovation in projects. With that said, please help me welcome Richard Fleming to the Visual Lounge. Welcome, Richard.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here.
I'm so excited to chat with you. We've had a chance to kind of get to know each other, just kind of pre-meeting or whatever. I'm super excited, but we're going to start you off where we start everybody. What's one tip you would give our audience about using video better in their work?
Oh, that's obvious. For me, it's think about the emotions that you want your audience to feel. So often we think about the business outcome that a video is supposed to supply, or we think about strategy or how many conversions. But at the end of the day, human beings make decisions based on emotions. And this is not to say you have to make your video weepy or sad, but you need to think about what is it you want your audience to feel so they walk away and will make an actionable decision based on that emotion.
So let me ask you about that, because I think that's, you know, of all 200 some episodes we've talked about, I don't know that we've talked a lot about emotion. So if we can, I'd like to just ask you, you know, in the workplace, emotions are often kind of either ignored and or like emotion, because often we tie emotions with like being emotional or not, you know, it's not a stable thing.
It's a misnomer.
Right, absolutely. So what advice would you give? Because I think there is going to be hesitancy to say like, well, we don't want to play with people's emotions. We don't want to go there. That feels unsafe. So what would you say? How would you help someone if someone said to you, hey, help us, we want to do this more, but gosh, how do we do that in a way that's safe?
Ironically, I would ask them, what's the emotion you're feeling when you think about using emotions? I mean, honestly, there's a lot of fear that's motivating that decision. And that's just the nature of being human. I think that in the corporate space, we tend to dehumanize people because we want them to be more productive. We want them to be more efficient. But at the end of the day, these people are giving you their lives. Like, you work a job, you live that job. You're there for a third of your life. And so I don't think it's helpful for us to forget that we're dealing with human beings. And the most effective training that I have seen and that I have created myself has been ones that honor the fact that we're human beings and that we have these lived experiences and would promote those. So if someone is feeling a bit nervous about it, I would say, again, to not think of it like you want your people to be emotional, but you have to understand that they are going to need to feel something in order to make a decision. And that's just science. 95% of our day is automated. We make decisions autonomously. We don't think about what's happening. And we later will rationalize them through reason. We'll say, well, I bought this new car, or I bought this new bag because of all these features and blah, blah. But really, at the end of the day, it satisfied a need for you. It gave you a sense of peace of mind. It gave you a sense of relief, or it gave you a sense of purpose or respect, or any of these things, or number of motivators. And you can tell kind of which people gravitate toward by talking to them. But if you don't know them very well, you can always determine what psychological motivators they have by looking at self-determination theory. which is a framework of psychology that analyzes how people are motivated to change behavior. How are they motivated to grow?
So, I love that advice. First of all, that we shouldn't dehumanize, and I do think I was just thinking as you were talking about like how many decisions are automated. I'm thinking like, yeah, gosh, I don't think about it because it's automated. So that's I think really insightful there. So let's talk a little bit about this a little bit more, because I do think one of the struggles for a lot of learning and development folks out there is they are asked to create these programs, and they may or may not be using video, but I think there's quite a few who are probably listening to this show who are, and they get to a point where they're asking themselves, is this really working? Are we really making a change or having an impact? And it sounds like a little bit of self-determination theory might have some impact on that, but I know you've got some other thoughts. So how do we go about, and this is kind of a big framing question for us today, how do we know if the things that we're going to make are going to be effective? And what are some of the things that you've learned? Because I know a lot of people will be like, well, you need to assess them. You need to do, the kind of standard training things. But what else do you got for us?
Well, that's kind of an interesting question too, because how are you assessing? When people talk about assessments, are you taking questionnaires? And whether you're using video or not, the purpose of training is for people to apply a skill that they didn't previously have, or to apply it in more frequency than they had prior. So if the skill is, hand washing, for example, how do you know when someone has completed a hand washing technique? So there are steps, there are measurable, actionable behaviors, observable behaviors that factor into your assessment. And I think the same thing is true for video. The advantage, though, is we have a lot more technology to assess video than we did prior. So I work with a company called Immersion that through wearable technology, you're able to determine whether or not people are, one, engaged in what they're watching, and two, that they, give a crap, so to speak. And you do that by tracking dopamine levels and oxytocin levels. So dopamine is the uncertainty molecule. If I were to hand you $5, you would have a little dopamine spike. You'd be like, oh, that was an unexpected reward. If I keep handing you $5 every 5 minutes in a repeatable pattern, that dopamine will stop spiking, even though you still enjoy the flow of money. So you want to make sure that you have people's attention and that you're creating a sense of uncertainty. Video is beautiful for that because you can direct a narrative, you can direct attention in every capacity through the visual interest that's on screen, through selective focus, through the use of warm colors and cool colors, to give people a sense of depth, to add audio elements to really immerse people. So the possibilities are limitless for gaining attention. But then the added benefit is that you can also create the emotional resonance that's fostered by levels of oxytocin. So it's like, they call it the care molecule. It's a little more complicated than that. And the main tenet here is that it's how you show people have this emotional resonance. And the cool thing about this technology is you can tell down to the second where people are engaged. And this is not just for pre-recorded video and marketing pieces, but it can also be for live presentations.
Okay, so I'm hearing all this, and it sounds amazing to be able to understand these things. I'm also the flag's going up and saying, well, you know what? I don't have that kind of budget or that kind of technology to go in and start measuring these things. So it feels like, I guess, what would you say? What's the rub here in terms of being able to do this stuff? Because in a perfect world, we'd always be doing these things. We'd always be understanding the impact. Maybe not feasible. Is it something that everyone can do, or is there some things that we can do to at least get somewhat there?
I mean, the app is launching in 2-3 weeks. It's called Six is the app, SIX. And if you have a Fitbit or some kind of cheap technology wearable, you can use it. And it'll be platform agnostic, so device agnostic. Even the Aura rings are trying to be incorporated. So we'll see what happens with that. But a lot of this cost being a factor is really just an excuse and a cop-out. I mean, what I'm talking about here are fundamentals that don't require you to spend a lot of money. Sure, you can get spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on immersive VR technology that tracks your eye scanning and stuff. But eye scan doesn't determine whether or not you're interested. It just determines whether or not you're looking at something. And you can I can wave my hand in front of you and you can be like, oh, I'm looking at that. I get your attention, but I'm not sustaining any emotional resonance or care by that action. And I think what these technologies do, even if you're not buying them and using them for your broad-based audience, you're able to improve your ability as a presenter, as a storyteller, as a creative, as an instructional designer, to get people's attention. You can track when you watch your own content, which I've done. I watched some stuff I made 10 years ago and wanted to see, does it still hold up? And I'll, for the most part, it does, but there are parts where I start to check out, and then the device reminds me that, like, yeah, you were not that engaged at this point. So it's good for me to go, oh, if I could make that change, or if I would do something differently, I would. And we want that because media palettes shift so dramatically over time. Before Breaking Bad, the way people watched and consumed TV was completely different. It's not that attention spans have necessarily changed, but it's that the mechanism by which, the language by which we communicate ideas in a television or media format has changed.
So, yeah. So I love the point that, like, look, you don't have to do this every time. There's obviously, any technology like this is going to become more accessible, I guess you could say, from a cost standpoint. Mm-hmm. I do want to go back to the idea of uncertainty, though, because there's something that's just kind of, it's itching the back of my head here in terms of my brain and I want to talk about, like, you've obviously done a lot of work in video, and you've done some very high end. If you're cutting a film or commercial for the Super Bowl, that's not a little thing, right? Because that's going to go out, regardless of whether it's good or not. It's going out in front of millions of people, so it better be pretty good. So you've got some experience here. I'm curious, as a creator, what have you found about creating uncertainty, particularly in a learning environment? What do you have any, like, patterns or things that you've seen that work particularly well that you could share with us? Or is it like, you just got to look at you just got to look at every circumstance. It depends. But I'm curious if you've learned anything about creating uncertainty in a way that really is impactful.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned self-determination theory a bit earlier, and I want to qualify that. What that means is, like food, water, shelter, there are physical things that you need for survival. Self-determination theory outlines and explicates the psychological things that keep you to survive. So you want a sense of autonomy or choice. You want to feel like you have agency over your actions, that the world is not just predetermined and you have some choice in there. You want a sense of competence, where you are applying your expertise, you are growing and developing as a person, you're moving to some kind of goal. And then you want relatedness. You want a sense of community. You want a sense of respect, to be respected, and to follow people, to be able to get feedback from other people. And you need all three of those things as a foundation. But additional elements, and the one to address your question, would be, how do you make things more uncertain and more interesting for a learner? And I think we really have got to tap back into our inner child and think about when we were curious about the world. When was curiosity a main driver for us? And that's not as well talked about as the autonomy, competence, and relatedness aspects of SDT, of self-determination theory, but it is a very important one that drives engagement. And I often will ask learning designers, when they're having trouble with a course, they're getting stuck, my question will be, would you take this? And why would you take this? And often they're not really that excited about the project. It's some kind of compliancy thing, or it's, some rote hard skill that they feel they need to change. And why wouldn't you make that the most exciting thing that you can? I'm assuming that you have a passion for learning design. If you don't really care for it, I'm not sure what advice I could give you. But if it's something that you really enjoy, there's a lot of opportunity to be able to engage people in a beautiful learning experience. And one of the ways that you can do that is to delay information, is to open what they call a story loop and not to close it. So years ago, I went to see, it was a remake of the Hercules movie. I forget what year it was. It was probably like 10 years ago. But it stood out to me because every challenge that Hercules faced would be solved within like the next scene. Like it'd be like if I go into a grocery store and it's completely empty and I'm like, oh my God, like there's no food. And then someone comes up immediately and says, no, there's food. It's right here. But if I'm like searching and struggling, you'd be like, oh God, like what happened? Is there an apocalypse? Did like the truck not arrive, or are there farms being destroyed? Like all these questions start ruminating in your brain. And so you want to be able to give learners that opportunity to make predictions And that's why you delay that information, is that you engage them in critical thinking by way of their predictions. And they do it naturally because they're curious. And I'll tell you, critical thinking is one of the most enormous things for our brains to undergo, which is why I mentioned at the beginning that 95% of our decisions are mostly subconscious and automatic. Because, if you look at Daniel Kahneman's research into system 1, system 2 thinking, it's much easier for us from a caloric standpoint. We burn fewer calories by letting this automation happen. And so to get somebody to think critically is like asking them to deadlift right in front of you, right? At a max rate. Like, that's not typical. And you can tell when you ask people complicated problems, whether or not they're doing the work by their pupils dilating. So if you ask somebody a math question that's difficult, watch their eyes. And if they make a guess so that they're not really engaged, you can tell by their pupils dilating. It's really a remarkable experience because it's a physical activity. Learning is a physical activity, and we have to treat it as such. And the way to get people excited is to make it fun and enjoyable.
Well, holy cow. Yeah. I mean, I love the story loop concept, and I'm seeing a lot of this, particularly YouTube creators, I think are starting to get really good at this, right? There's the concept of the hook, and we've talked about the hook on the show before, but like, there's a creator I mentioned on the show before. Her name is Jenny Hoyas. She's probably 18, 19 years old. She's doing amazing in the world of creation. And she's now telling people about her patterns of how she creates these videos. And one of the things she often does is she starts with that hook in the first 5 seconds, but also she's almost teasing the outcome, but not quite leaving it like, is it resolved? And so I think that's kind of the thing I'm hearing, is that like, you need to help people to see like, there's a direction here, but you gotta fill in the pieces and help. Or you gotta be willing to pay the price to get the pieces filled in. It's like a great mystery, right? Like I read a book and there's who did it at the end. I'm probably making guesses along the way.
Yeah. And it's unfortunate because I think a lot of learning designers, they're striving for clarity. Like their goal is to make things simpler, to not tease anything. Because they're like, you're working hard enough already, so let me make it easy. But I think there's some work that you want the learner to do. And that's really what the equation is how do you have that balance of, I want to give you something to investigate and to solve on your own and to be curious about. But at the end, I will provide clarity so that we answer all these things. And one of the simplest ways is just to think, okay, so I have the knowledge of the tactic that they need to take or the technique they need to perform. Now let's pair it to the human. Why does this matter? A great example would be if I'm doing Salesforce training, and people are being onboarded for that. There are specific things I need to tell them about Salesforce. But the reason why is not because they need to be certified or because their boss wants them to. It's because they want to better connect with their customers. They want to be able to have that leg up. And so I'm watching this scene from The Bear yesterday, and I'm a little bit slow on the season, so I'm not going to spoil anything for you guys. But second season, 7th episode, Richie, one of the brothers, he's basically like trying to work at this really high-end restaurant and get an experience. And he's reading this book called like Unreasonable Hospitality or something like that. And the idea is like that you're constantly thinking about the customer. And so he goes to this really fancy restaurant and you see all these people that are just like a flawless, perfectly well-oiled machine running around and figuring these things out. And they're getting notes about the guests and they're passing them along between the servers. And so they find out that this one family is leaving, their daughter's leaving, and she's never had Chicago deep dish pizza. So she's like upset that this is happening. Richie runs out to a famous deep dish spot, grabs a pizza, brings it back, and the chef prepares this really crazy version using that pizza as the base. And then they all get to have it. And so you think about like this reward experience of having this like high hospitality of the why this stuff matters, changed Richie's perspective about what it meant to work in the restaurant industry, that the word hospitality meant something. It was like combining, like you're almost treating people like they're a patient and you're taking care of them. And so there's something about connecting the human to that makes it much more enjoyable. And even using a story like that in the context of corporate training around Salesforce makes it a lot more acceptable for an audience, and says like, now they get the inspiration of like, yeah, I want to be like Richie. Like that sounds amazing. Seeing the expression of that woman on her face that she was able to try this. Like, it gave her an experience that made that whole night memorable. We have the same opportunity as learning designers. We just kind of have to pair those two things together.
So again, kind of thinking brass tacks here, right? I'm guessing, you know, a couple things come to mind. One, I think you're right about instructional designers in particular are shooting for clarity. That's kind of the, like, hey, let's, not only is it clarity, but it's clarity as fast as we can. Let's get you to the end state of doing the thing that we think you need to do. And oftentimes that maybe negates or says, like, well, to get to clarity, we're not going to tell a story. We're not going to focus on the customer because, well, frankly, there's 300 of you. And so I don't know what you all need. So I'm just going to give you kind of the general palette of pick something from the menu. There you go. So I'm curious in that, like, one of the challenges that we, and this is a question we always get asked, is about length of video, right? Like, because, you know, fast, easy, we want it fast and we want it done and we want people, we're taking up people's time. So that's a cost factor. And we have some research. I want to get your opinion. And for clarity, I know you have not seen this research. In fact, no one's seen it quite yet. TechSmith is releasing we've had a video viewer study. So we look on kind of viewer habits and preferences about video. And I just want to get your take about this. So this is new this year. This will come out later this year as a published article, but we've done this in 2013, 16, 18, and 2021. So just kind of setting context here. So this isn't the first year we've looked at this. Okay, so here's the research from that study. So how long do you prefer instructional videos to be? And this is people's preferences about a video, and based on videos that they've watched in the last like month, right? So I get preferences that are always problematic because people will say things that then the reality is they don't ever watch longer videos or whatever. But to me, this has been really interesting because we've seen this shift. It used to be the last version of this that we did 7 to 9 minutes and like 3 to 4 minutes were like tied at the longest. But since 2013, we've seen the length of video preference get longer. And what I'm hearing from you is that maybe the things that we should be adding in there, and not necessarily adding just to add, but we should be adding context and more kind of this engagement, this curiosity piece, and that it would be okay. But I'm curious, from a length of video, I mean, you've done probably 30-second, 60-second ads a ton. I'm guessing your Super Bowl ad was either 30 seconds or 60 seconds. Sounds like you've done some longer films. What's your reaction to this data in terms of preferences and what we've been talking about?
Yeah, so usually when people ask me how long should a video be, the answer is as long as it needs to be. And there are different outcomes and different objectives with each video and video length. So I love that this at least exists because there's been this argument about, oh no, people need short content. And I've had some of my clients where I made content for in the past, like the 10-year-old video. This one client who's in industrial steel manufacturing is like, I went from a 3-day workshop to a day and a half. Like, they forced me to do that. So I'm losing all of this time. And I remember there was an instructional designer, like a SME for a sales training company, who, when he commented on our work, he was like, there are too many pauses. There's too much like dead space. And you want just things to cut like right along. And I always thought that was interesting, is it's like certain media needs to breathe, and you need people to be able to take their time. So when you watch these movies that have very long sweeping shots, that's there for a reason. They're not just trying to buy your time, or like fill some kind of obligation to the distributor. There's an emotional reason for it. It gives you time to reset. So that's one aspect of just like, I think media has a specific outcome. Maybe the reason you haven't seen instructional videos shorter than 30 seconds is because what can you learn in 30 seconds that would be of value to you? Now, I would argue, and I've often thought about this, like for things like hand washing as a great example, that time is 30 seconds to properly wash your hands. It would be great for you to go through that process while it is, running. So you have like a nice reminder. It serves as a timer. So the media is not just instructional in nature, but it's also functional. And I would also the other feedback that I thought was interesting is, and I'd be curious how you guys did the study, because a lot of tutorials on YouTube, for example, are in that 10 to 20 minute range, partly for monetization reasons, but also because they have all this other, I would say probably for monetization reasons, but people who are watching them may not be watching the full 10-minute videos. So it clocks it as being it's a 10-minute long video, yet I'm only watching maybe 3 minutes of it to the section where I need it. If I go to search for, find a camera setting or figure out some kind of error message on an editing software, what is the actual investment of time I'm going to have in that 10-minute video? I might just scan right ahead to the thing I need. So does the study incorporate that, or how do you guys measure? Is it just preferential questionnaires?
We do ask them where they last watched videos, and a lot of them are YouTube. So I think that's a really interesting observation. The other thing that we looked at with this is what were they hoping, like, why were they watching it, right? Like
yep.
When they're watching it, like, and it gets a little complicated and we don't have it all fleshed out. So I want to be careful about how I talk about it, but like looking at like the reasons you're watching a video, is it that you want to learn about a general topic? Is it that you've got a specific problem to solve, which I think is what you're speaking to, right? I go to YouTube, I've got to fix this thing, and I don't care about your intro. I don't care about your like and subscribe. What I care about is the answer to my problem. And that's, so that's kind of, we do break it out and look at like which video length towards which reason why you might be watching a video, right? I was forced to. It's compliance. And you can see the differences in kind of the change in like, it's usually like I have value I'm trying to gain is longer than like, oh, I had to, please keep it as short as possible. So I think it is an interesting observation, because another question that we've asked over the years is about why people stop. And the thing that you said, that people get that 3 minutes and they're done, is often a reason people stop. They stop watching because they got what they needed. Whereas in the YouTube world, it's like, well, that hurts my retention. But like in a L&D world, it's like, great, you got what you needed, move on, So, well, thank you for that, your commentary on that, because I do think that is a really valuable insight. And I think it's one of those questions that always comes up. And I think people will lead in a leadership kind of perspective. They say to the leaders, hey, can we make this a little longer? Can we introduce story? Can we introduce this curiosity pieces? And they're like, no, we just want to get into it, right? There's almost that pushback because, well, it needs to be 3 minutes, or long as needed, but keep it really short. So.
Yeah. And I want to back up slightly on that, because I think when I talk about adding stories, I don't think that they have to be very long form. Probably the longest form we did was a 40-minute movie that we made for Carrie. They're a large flavor company, and they needed to drive a culture change, and they used that as the mechanism to drive actionable behavior and to shift the culture as a whole. And I think that was really needed. Like, you can't steer a ship that large in a 3-minute micro learning. It's just not going to happen. So, and obviously, like, there are elements that you can withdraw from, or you can simplify and make it, distilled. But there's this fixation with efficiency, and I think that's the wrong conversation to be having. Like, yeah, we want to save people money. I don't want to take people off the plant floor. In an ideal world, I would have training on the floor. I think that's one thing, one opportunity people miss a lot, which is, what are you doing the training for? Are you trying to get people to go through this process in the workshop and then to go onto the plant floor and apply it? Like, that doesn't really make much sense. It's more like the workshop is the ticket to entry. That's where you start and say, okay, this is the initiation. And now you spend 12 to 14 weeks actually doing the training on the floor through mentorship, through modeling, through all these other elements that really drive that behavior and make it habitual. So again, it's the purpose behind why you're using video. And I think the easiest is just, it's inspiration and aspiration. It's getting people to either watch a scenario and say to themselves, I want that kind of world. I want to be a part of that world. And so what do I need to do to make that happen? That's what they leave with. Or they look at it as almost like a post-mortem. They go, that was terrible. Like that was a disastrous experience of whatever happened to that person. Very tragic. How could I not ever repeat that again? And so they have different functions, based on the kind of messaging you want. It's also why, when IDs or corporate trainers will say, we don't want to have bad endings or sad endings in their corporate training. Why not? Like, it serves a specific purpose. So you just have to make sure that you know what that is. If you want the actionable behavior change, you want something that's aspirational and positive. But if you want something that is more, having deductive reasoning or examining why things went wrong and engaging that critical thinking, have something that is more somber.
Yeah. Well, Richard, I appreciate all your insights, and I agree with you on it's not about just, having long stories. It's, using story appropriately throughout, but that does add, adds, you have to do the work. You have to add it in there. So appreciate that insight. We're going to keep things moving here. Appreciate all your thoughts and insights, but now it's time for speedrun questions. If you're new to the podcast, speedrun questions are quick, fast questions determined by the roll of dice. So let's go ahead and dive in.
Let's do it.
All right, I'm going to bring up our dice cam. We've been on a little bit of hiatus because we had a little break where I was in a different setup with different, had to move stuff around. But here we go. First roll of the die, though, comes up, and that is an 8. Easy one to read on the dice. So, Richard, obviously, as a creator, you, again, so many awesome sounding experiences. I really should ask you about the Super Bowl commercial. Maybe we'll squeeze it in at the end. Where do you turn for inspiration? Obviously, you have probably watched with your thousands of hours of film, but where's your kind of go to, I need to be inspired. What's that process look like?
I read a lot of creative books or books about creativity. So you'd mentioned kind of in my introduction about Foresight, which is a creative innovation model that I got certified because a lot of times our clients they were struggling with how to be more creative. So I'll look to resources like that, or I'm recently reading Stephen Pressfield's book, Put Your Ass Where Your Heart Wants to Be. And it's great. It's honestly a wonderful read. I would recommend his stuff. He also did The Art of War and Do the Work. Awesome.
Well, thank you for that. And our next question from the die, as long as it's not an 8, is a number 1. I think I warned you about this question. So, all's fair in podcasting, right? If you could have dinner with any person, living, dead, who would it be and why?
Oh, man. So it would be a filmmaker, and it would either be, I'd say if I had to just pick one person, I would say Orson Welles. I think his storytelling is absolutely peak, and he had the funniest, most riotous kind of humor. And I love the man. I love his work. I think he was a brilliant filmmaker that got robbed of that through the studio scene at the time. But I'd love to have dinner with him. I think he'd be a fantastically entertaining guest.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. And thank you for that. So we'll do one more here. Oh, I dropped the die. I missed it completely. Should have just dropped it in. And that is, the dot is at the bottom. So I always have to explain this. That means that this is a number 6. Okay. So in your life, I'm sure you've received some piece of advice or something that has had huge impact on you. So what is a piece of advice that has just had that lasting impact that you would want to share with us?
Related to video, related to art, related to instructional design?
You can go in any direction that you choose. We keep it open for a reason.
So one of my favorite filmmakers is an Iranian named Abbas Kiarostami. He died, about 10 years ago, almost, I think 2016. And I read his book, Lessons with Kiarostami, and the first 2 pages were so moving to me, I cried reading it. It answered all of these questions. And so one of the things that I think the advice he was giving was an older version of me comforting a younger version. And it's hard to kind of encapsulate it into one thing, but I would say what I got out of that book was taking time to look, taking time to watch your world and examine things. And he would often just sit in a place quietly and stare at stuff. He would look around at things. And I think we don't spend enough time sitting and contemplating and not doing things for the sake of not doing them. So that would be my biggest advice, is take time to sit and do nothing beyond the act of sitting.
I love that. Hard to do in this kind of crazy filled,
super hard
world, but no, great advice. Thank you for that. Richard,
well, and I'll just briefly add, just that, part of the thing that people don't realize is you have to factor in procrastination. Procrastination is part of the creative process. And Da Vinci used to do that all the time. He would work on a piece and then schedule time to not work on it and not do anything with it. And I think that, this rush of trying to get things done often puts us at odds with that creative process. So if you're not feeling creative, it's a really good way to re-inspire is to welcome boredom and let your mind do the work for you.
Yeah. Well, I think that's why so many great ideas happen in showers, right? Because you have no
100%.
No reason, nothing else to do. It's just standing there. So, Richard, I do want to ask you because I'm just super curious, and I think the audience would love to know. Can you tell us anything about the Super Bowl commercial you worked on?
Yeah, it was for Best Buy. It was a number of years ago. I don't really recommend it. This is one of the things I would often have arguments with the agency about stuff. I didn't really have the kind of involvement to say anything about this particular project. It's so hierarchical. But I remember we would do tests on stuff. There was like an Applebee's promo, it was another Best Buy promo. And as it came through, all we had were animatics. So we had tested them in some like strip mall in Atlanta, and they came back and were like, well, they tested well. And I'm sitting here telling them like, this is a disaster. This is going to be a disaster. And sure enough, they launched it and it was an absolute train wreck. This is not the Super Bowl spot. This is a different project, but same client. And it was just, you could tell, but because the CFO said they signed off, yep, this was done. This has been tested. Everyone approved it, but you knew it wasn't good. And I think that's partly why I'm more about the technology, the wearables, because I want to actually know if people like my stuff. And if you read Immersion, they talk about predicting Super Bowl successes, and what USA Today would rank as the most liked Super Bowl spots were not the same ones that led to an increase in sales. And that's why I think that wearable stuff matters, because the wearables could tell who was going to buy what from the Super Bowl spot. I'll tell you, they didn't buy for mine. So it's regrettable.
Well, but great insight, right? Like that's led to a life full of lessons. And I appreciate that, because I think oftentimes we have high expectations about things that probably from a quality standpoint were high quality, probably spent a lot of budget on the making of that, but that doesn't mean it's always effective. And I can appreciate that.
Yeah. And honestly, if you got a second, I realized that no one asks really why I'm not doing that work now. Like I got to that level and like there was more to do. Why am I still not in marketing? And I just take it for granted that people just assume that I'm doing the thing that I want to be doing, but it's more than that, in that marketing is 95% metrics right now, and less than 5% creativity. So you will watch an ad for, let's say, Coca-Cola that was an ambient ad 3 years ago. They just recycle them. And so there's not a lot of creativity, surprisingly, in that field. But also, when I think about where I could have the largest impact on the world, I look at corporations, because they are these fiefdoms. They're so large. They're like these large-scale tribes. And they have a lot of influence, not only on the people that work for them, but on the customers that they impact. So I think there's an opportunity for us to really do a lot more good in learning and training than we could by selling products that people may or may not even resonate with. And that's why I got out of that game. I love what I'm doing in L&D, and it is my untiring passion. I wish people spent more on training, and I wish they saw the impact that it can have, because I've seen it change lives personally, and I want to keep going with that.
Well, that is awesome. And with that said, we'd love to make sure that people can connect with you and work with you. So where would you recommend, how should they connect with you? What should they go look at?
I think the best way is just through LinkedIn. So it's just visual storyteller is the last little tag. So linkedin.com/in/visual storyteller. And then sage.media is my company. We also have an off-the-shelf little repository of online courses that's just sage.academy. So we don't have any .coms. We're super hip. It really actually bothers a lot of, trying to sign up for stuff. People don't update .medias and .academies, but sage.academy is the off-the-shelf version of our methodology applied to our own courses. So they're really niche soft skill topics. But yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions or connect on a project. We've got a few months in between funding for a documentary we're working on in the food industry. So I've got some bandwidth for that if people are available.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, Richard, I've got some things I need to go and learn about, some things to go read, some things to think about, which I think is always an indicator of a good conversation. I think I benefit way more from these conversations than anybody else listening and or participating otherwise. But with that said, we always like to end the show, get the kind of that wrap up here. Richard, what is your final take for today's show?
I'll go back to the beginning piece of advice, which is don't negate or neglect the value of using emotions in training. It's the sole reason that people will actually change their behavior.
Perfect. I love it. Well, thank you, Richard. Appreciate
you. Is that shorter than 10 seconds?
No, you're good. You could be longer. But thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, you're a great presenter, Matt. I really appreciate it. It was great.
Thank you so much. All right, everybody, you heard all the things that Richard talked about, and we are so grateful for him. And really stop and think about some of these things that he's talked about and see how it can affect the impact that you're having. Pulling in that emotion, pulling in that story, not being afraid to build some curiosity. You don't have to give up clarity. I think you can do both. And I think that's really powerful. And that's going to take time. You're going to have to put in the reps and figure it out. And then he talked about the great technology to look forward to, like, hey, we can start to understand on a physiological basis, does this work? Does it have the impact that we're hoping? And obviously some of you probably are thinking that's, future stuff, but it's coming. And hopefully it'll be something that we can all take advantage of to help make sure we're having the impact that we desire. So with that said, we want to make sure that we're having as much impact with you as we can. We hope that you like and subscribe. If you got questions, you can always email us at thevisuallounge@textment.com. And of course, we like to end our show the same way every single time because it matters. We want you to get better. We want you to improve. We hope you take a little time to level up every single day. Thanks so much.